In this video, I'm going to begin by focusing on the relationship between national governments and state governments. And if you go back to our original discussions in the Assessing Democracy lecture videos, when I described the difference between unitary, confederate, and federalist systems, the shortcut that I use to describe a federalist system is N is greater than or equal to S, denoting that the national government in some cases is greater than the state governments, but in sometimes they're equal. And actually, if I was doing a really complete job, I think there would be another symbol that I've never seen before that would have been N is greater than S, N is less than S, and then N is equal to S. I don't know what that would look like. But that's the supremacy clause in truth. And so I'm going to go into the explanation of the supremacy clause with a warning that I've given before that I'm going to reiterate one more time, and then I'm going to try not to mention it again. The way I talk about the supremacy clause is different than the way they talk about the supremacy clause in the textbook, and different than the way that you'll find discussions of the supremacy clause if you go online. And that's, once again, why it's so important that students watch the lecture videos in order to answer my essay questions, because I talk about things differently than other political scientists. And so when a student gives a definition of the supremacy clause that isn't what I have in my lecture notes and doesn't emphasize the things that I emphasize in the lecture videos, I know that they've gotten the information elsewhere. So with that caveat in mind, let me give the definition of the supremacy clause. Now, before I do, if you're reading the screen right now, there's a word that should stand out in this definition. What word would it be? It should be legitimate. Why? Because legitimate is underlined, it's bold, and it's italicized. Okay? Here's the definition of the supremacy clause. Any conflict between a legitimate action of the national government and a legitimate action of the state will be resolved in favor of the national government. Well, obviously, if you're elaborating on this definition, what it's going to hinge on is the meaning of the word legitimate. So what do I mean by that? An action, which can be a law or it can be an executive order, an action is legitimate if the Constitution permits it. An action is illegitimate if the Constitution does permit it. So any conflict between a legitimate action, that is an action on the part of the national government that is constitutionally permitted, and an action on the part of the state government that is constitutionally permitted, will be resolved in favor of the national government. So let me give you an example, but we're going to go over a couple of examples. We're going to talk about medical marijuana. In 1970, the federal government passed something called the Controlled Substance Act. And in this act, it defined marijuana as a Schedule I drug. And by that, it meant that marijuana was had a high potential for abuse, and there was no medicinal value. What it did was it controlled and regulated the interstate sale, transportation, and use of controlled substances, of which marijuana was one. Now, just to clarify, you can see the word interstate is, what's the word? Italicized, I apologize. When I talk about interstate commerce, I'm talking about commerce that happens in between states. Not something that happens entirely in a state, but something that happens in between states. The Controlled Substance Act regulated the interstate sale, transportation, and use of controlled substances of which marijuana was one of them. Now, is this a legitimate power on the part of the national government? Well, yes, it is, because one of the enumerated powers gives Congress the authority to regulate interstate commerce. So this is clearly a legitimate power on the part of the federal government to regulate the interstate sale, transportation, and use of controlled substances. Okay. In 1996, California passed what was called Proposition 215. And what Proposition 215 did is it made medical marijuana legal in California. But it's important to keep in mind that what it did was it legalized intrastate medicinal marijuana. In other words, it legalized marijuana as long as it was produced and sold and used solely within California. Marijuana that went across state lines would not be legal because that becomes interstate commerce and that's federal. So the way the courts have interpreted the Commerce Clause, the way they've interpreted this notion that Congress has the authority to regulate interstate commerce has been very, very broad. So in other words, suppose you have somebody who's grown marijuana in accordance with the California Compassionate Use Act. They've grown the limited number of plants in the soil in California, but they've irrigated the plants using plastic that was purchased from a factory made in Kentucky. And the water that they're watering the plants with comes from the Owens Valley, so it comes across state lines. So it's water that's come from out of state into state. The courts have interpreted the Interstate Commerce Clause such that that marijuana, although it's grown inside California, following all the laws of California, Congress can still consider that interstate commerce. Now, if somebody does, as I said before, does a state have the authority to determine what kind of prescriptions are sold within the state? Is that a legitimate power of the state government? Well, yes, it is. But the way the courts have interpreted the Commerce Clause, it's been very broad. And so the way it works is that if an individual is following a legitimate state law, like the California Compassionate Use Act, and at the same time, they're breaking a legitimate federal law, that individual can be arrested, right? Because in this case, what you have is you have a conflict between a legitimate federal law, the Controlled Substance Act, and a legitimate state law, the Compassionate Use Act. And in a case like that, the national government's law is going to take precedence. Now, one of the things that students ask me all the time is they'll say, well, then why is the Compassionate Use Act even allowed to be a law? If the national government can just oversee that, override that, why are they even allowed to do that? Well, that's part of the negotiation that happens in a federalist system. See, if somebody was arrested in California for violating the Controlled Substance Act, they wouldn't be arrested by a state law enforcement officer. They would be arrested by a federal law enforcement officer. It might be the FBI. It may be somebody from the Food and the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. But the federal government wouldn't have the ability to override the Compassionate Use Act or invalidate the Compassionate Use Act. But they do have the authority to enforce federal law. And so what's happened over time is that different presidents have approached this differently. So when President Obama came into power back in 2008 up to 2016, he made a decision that the federal government wasn't going to expend resources going after legally chartered businesses that sold marijuana, but he reserved the right to do so. So the federal government can decide to what extent it wants to go after dispensaries in California. It still has that authority because when there's a conflict between a legitimate federal law and a legitimate state law, the legitimate federal law prevails. But that doesn't mean that the state of California can't pass laws about the intrastate sale of marijuana. And this is why I say federalism can be kind of complicated, because if you're a little bit confused about all that, yeah, rightfully so. That's the distribution of power. That's why I say it's constantly being negotiated. And that's why I predict that over time, as more and more states pass medicinal marijuana laws, you're going to see the federal government being less willing to enforce the Controlled Substance Act. But then again, we'll find out. Now, in the next video, I'm going to talk about interstate relationships between the states.